But we're going to move on now to childhood development, which is where we're going to spend most of our time. And we've broken this down into 3 different components. So let's start with how infants and children physically develop. So starting off with the nervous system. So think back to our neuroscience lecture. This is how do their neurons, how do their brains, how does that kind of thing develop? So we know that infants have rapid gray matter growth. So what that means, gray matter, again, is like the lobes, the outside parts of your brain. They're the cell bodies of your neurons. There's a lot of rapid growth in childhood, followed by what we call synaptic pruning now. So again, if you remember, a synapse is that gap between an axon terminal and the dendrite of the next neuron. In essence, the gap between the mouth and the ear if they're communicating a message. So when you're an infant, you're rapidly growing gray matter. So you're having a bunch of these neuronal connections. This neuron is talking to a bunch of different people. This one's talking to even more. But when you prune those synapses, you basically take away or delete this connection. So maybe, let's say like synaptic pruning is like if you are a neuron and you have a bunch of different friends that you talk to, and then you decide kind of over time, like who your real friends are and like who you want to maintain relationships with. So they kind of like cut off, they don't really talk to this neuron much anymore. So that mouth-ear connection kind of goes away. So that's what happens in your brain. So cells and connections that aren't useful, maybe like that friend that you're not quite as close with anymore, or you don't need to interact with as much, are in essence deleted. You may have heard this phrase before, use it or lose it. And that's kind of true. If you don't use this interaction or this connection, if you don't really talk to this friend much, you're going to lose that connection. It's going to prune off. So what that looks like in real life, this is an example of different aging from newborn up past 6 months as the infant is pruning. I think this is really cool. So this is the cartoon version of a neuron, but here's what it actually looks like. So you can make out each of these little kind of black lines, these spider looking things are neurons. You can make out the cell body. You've got your little dendrites, you got your long axon, the axon's talking to another dendrite, etc. So when you're first born, there's some neurons there, some scaffolding, but it's pretty sparse. As you kind of get some experience with the world, you're starting to kind of talk to more people and branch out and figure out what's important. Before you prune, there are so many connections. Infants have actually way more connections in their brain than an adult does. And part of the reason is they haven't yet figured out what friends they want to stay in contact with and what aren't as helpful to them. So before pruning, there's just chaos. There's not a lot that can happen there. But after pruning, so after you start to figure out what connections you want to use more, what connections are more important to you, more beneficial, you delete the ones that aren't. So you decrease the amount of connections that you have, again, to a manageable, normal amount. So this is kind of the process of synaptic pruning. But in addition to that, we also get myelination. So think back to the neuroscience chapter again. Do you remember what myelination does? So myelin is, again, these little yellow kind of blobs on an axon. They're kind of this fatty substance that insulates the axon, and it's in charge of making that action potential way more efficient. It speeds up the neuronal communication because now the message only has to hop from node to node instead of going through the entire axon. So, as you may kind of assume, myelination is really important. Myelination is something that kind of changes over time as you start to really use that neuron, that connection. You got to make it more efficient if you're going to keep using it, right? So myelination continues as you grow up from infancy to childhood to adolescence. You start to myelinate the neurons and the connections that you're going to use most frequently. In addition to that, we've shown that researchers have shown that there is a spurt or a fast increase in myelination in the different language areas of the brain. So a variety of the kind of temporal, frontal, parietal region. Language is everywhere. That doesn't really help you. But those areas tend to myelinate a lot in the 6 to 13-year-old range. And so if you kind of think about what that might look like behaviorally, we know that as a child is kind of, entering school, 5 to 6 years old, and they're kind of developing their reading skills in school. 6 to 13 is kind of that critical period where individuals learn and are best capable of picking up a new language. So it kind of makes sense that this age range where myelination is occurring is that sensitive period for where they're most able to make those connections and grasp that new language. So that's why, for instance, maybe when you were young, your parents might have exposed you to a second language, but maybe as if you're trying to take a language in college or high school, it might be a little bit more difficult, right? So we've learned that individuals who are bilingual, who learn their second language before this critical period, before the age of about 10 or so, are able to pick up and process their second language in the same language areas that they process their first. But if you learn a language, like I didn't learn my second language until high school. It's gonna kind of get put in the secondary, a different area of my brain because I learned it after that critical period. Unfortunately, the US does, second language learning in high school to start with, or maybe middle school if you're lucky, but after the sensitive period. So keep that in mind if you want to have your children learn a second language or not. Starting young is going to make them a lot easier to pick up that second language. So let's talk a little bit more about pruning, and I'm going to show you a short video. Again, we'll see if this works.